It was July 1944. The war was still not over yet. Bombs were still falling, bodies were still being counted. And somewhere in the mountains of New Hampshire, in a resort hotel that smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke, 730 men from 44 countries sat down to decide what money would mean after the world stopped burning. Most of them had no idea they were building a cage. They called it the Bretton Woods Conference. The official story is that it was a cooperative effort, a noble attempt to prevent another Great Depression, to stop the currency wars that had made the 1930s so catastrophic. And in some ways, that story is true. But here is the part they leave out of the textbooks. Only one country walked into that room with all the leverage. Only one country had survived the war with its factories intact, its cities unburned, and its gold reserves overflowing. And that country had a very specific idea about how the new financial system should work. That country was the United States. And the idea was simple. Every currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone would be backed by gold, which meant that the dollar was not just America's currency anymore, it was everyone's currency, whether everyone agreed or not. One man tried to stop it. His name was John Maynard Keynes. He was British, brilliant, and increasingly aware that his country had just spent itself into near total dependence on American loans. He arrived at Bretton Woods with a counter-proposal. Instead of building the system around any single nation's currency, create something new, a neutral global currency, something no government could control or manipulate. He called it the Bancor. It was an elegant idea. It was also completely dead on arrival. The American delegation, led by a man named Harry Dexter White, was not interested in elegant ideas that reduced American power. The United States held roughly 2/3 of the world's gold supply at that point. They did not need a compromise. They needed a signature. Keynes lost. The dollar won, and the world moved on. Now here's where it gets interesting. Under the Bretton Woods system, every country agreed to hold dollars as their reserve currency. Their own currencies were pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the dollar itself was convertible to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. It sounds reasonable on paper, almost elegant, but what it actually meant was this. If you were France and you needed to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you were Japan and you needed to settle international debts, you needed dollars. If you were any country on earth trying to participate in global trade, you needed dollars, which meant you needed to keep buying them, holding them, trusting them. America had effectively made its currency the operating system of the entire global economy. And like any operating system, it came with terms and conditions that most users never read. For about 25 years, the system worked. The global economy rebuilt, trade expanded, and the dollar, backed by American gold and American industrial dominance, held its value. There was a quiet confidence in the system, an assumption that it was permanent. It was not permanent. By the late 1960s, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The United States was spending enormous amounts it did not have. The Vietnam War was consuming billions. Lyndon Johnson's domestic programs were consuming billions more. And crucially, the US was printing dollars to cover the gap. Other countries noticed. If the dollar was supposed to be worth a fixed amount of gold, and America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them, then the whole system was based on a promise that was becoming harder to believe. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, who was never particularly sentimental on American goodwill, started converting its dollar reserves into actual gold. He sent ships across the Atlantic to collect it. Other countries started doing the same. The math was simple and catastrophic. America did not have enough gold to honor all the dollars floating around the world. The gap between the promise and the reality was getting wider every month. And in August of 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and did something that almost no one in the public understood the full significance of. He closed the gold window. Effective immediately, the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold at any price. The fixed exchange rates were gone. The foundational agreement of the entire post-war monetary system was torn up in a 15-minute address that Nixon somehow managed to frame as an act of strength. He called it protecting the dollar. What he was actually doing was defaulting, not in the way a person defaults on a loan, more quietly than that, more consequentially than that. He was telling every country that had trusted the system, that had held dollars instead of gold because they were promised those dollars were as good as gold, that the promise was no longer operative. It should have destroyed the dollar's global dominance. By any logical measure, it should have. It did not. And a reason why is perhaps the most underappreciated story in modern economics. A few years later, in the early 1970s, the Nixon administration, specifically Secretary of State Kissinger, negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia. The details were not fully public for decades, but the basic structure was this. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi regime. The other OPEC nations followed. Suddenly, every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, needed dollars to buy it, not because of gold, not because of Bretton Woods, but because of petroleum. The dollar had transformed from a gold-backed currency into a petrodollar. The foundation had changed completely, but the dependency remained. And this is the mechanism that most people have never been clearly shown. The United States gets to print the currency that the world needs to function, which means America can run deficits that would bankrupt any other country. It can borrow cheaply because demand for dollars never disappears. It can fund its military, its debt, its government, partly on the silent backs of every other nation that must hold dollars in reserve just to participate in global trade. Economists have a polite term for it. They call it the exorbitant privilege. The French, who coined the phrase in the 1960s, did not mean it as a compliment. Now zoom out, because here's where we are today. That system, which was never voted on by the world, which was decided in a mountain hotel by men who held all the leverage, is showing its age. China has been building alternative trade settlement systems for years. The BRICS nations have been openly discussing ways to reduce dollar dependency. Saudi Arabia has quietly begun accepting payment in other currencies for some oil deals. The share of global reserves held in dollars has been declining slowly but steadily for 2 decades. None of this means the dollar is about to collapse. Anyone who tells you that on a timeline shorter than decades is probably selling something. But it does mean something important. The architecture of the global financial system was not designed by economists. It was not designed by markets. It was designed by power, by leverage, by the particular historical accident that one country emerged from a world war with most of the gold and none of the damage. And the system that came from that moment has shaped everything since. Your country's interest rates, the price of goods that cross borders, the foreign policy calculations of governments you've never heard of, the quiet economic pressure felt by developing nations that must earn dollars before they can buy anything priced in them. All of it flows from a negotiation that most people have never heard of in a hotel in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944. Keynes flew home from Bretton Woods exhausted and defeated. He died less than 2 years later. Some historians think the stress of watching his Bancor idea destroyed broke him something. His neutral global currency, the one no single nation could control, never came close to existing. Though it is worth noting, right now, in rooms far less picturesque than the Mount Washington Hotel, that idea is being discussed again. Not by economists with elegant theories, by governments that have quietly decided they would prefer a world where one country's domestic politics cannot freeze their access to the global financial system. Whether they succeed is the question nobody can answer yet, but the fact that they're asking it tells you something important about how much the world has changed since the summer of 1944. and how much of what we call the global economy is really just an old agreement held together by habit, inertia, and the memory of a leverage that the United States no longer holds so completely as it once did.